One suspect is dead and another is on the run after the Boston Marathon bombings and the death of an MIT campus officer. The two suspects are thought to be of Chechnyan descent, raising much debate over the relevance of their origin and the connection to this week's terrorist attacks. UF Associate Professor of Political Science Brian Muraski believes the suspects acted independently of their country.
So again, I'm not sure that I would label it a Chechen movement. I mean, there is clearly a number of insurgencies and insurgents who would like to see the country, or I'm sorry, the region break away from the country. Whether that has anything at all to do with the United States, that's seems very far removed in my mind.
Moraski says 9/11 changed the relationship between Russia and the United States and must be considered when discussing the events from this past week.
When 9/11 hit, for the Russian side, it kind of reaffirmed this perspective that in the developed world, Russia was not alone and shouldn't be seen as alone. At the same time, critics of the Russian regime argue that of course, 9/11 gave them greater leverage for cracking down even harder on Chechen insurgents.
Paul Danieri, the dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Florida, also believes that the bombings and shootings have not been an extension of international conflict. I spoke with Danieri today on political tensions possibly in sight. In the wake of the Boston bombings and the two suspects, one now dead, one still at large, how important is it in understanding their backgrounds from where they're from, Chechnya, to better understanding this whole event?
I don't think we know yet. I don't think we know whether their backgrounds in Chechnya were part of the motivation for what they did or whether it was completely disconnected. So I think for the authorities, I think it's really important, and for those of us who are curious, it's really important that they capture this second person alive and try to figure that out.
And when Chechnya left the Soviet Union in '91, was it common to see people leaving the area and people becoming radicalized because of this?
When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Chechnya was part of what became Russia. Beginning really in 1994, it became there was a very violent separatist movement, and Russian troops went in and very violently tried to suppress the rebellion and really failed. And so for much of the second half of the 1990s, Chechnya was technically part of Russia, but de facto was running itself. There was an immense amount of violence, and there were a huge number of refugees created by that violence. People fled.
And the two suspects, being 26 and 19, were young at this time, but definitely were exposed to that. So do you think that has any type of an influence?
Again, I'm really loath to speculate on those individuals since I don't know anything about them in particular. The place was very violent. We don't, I believe, yet know when exactly they left. But to the extent they were following matters in their homeland, things have continued to be violent. There's continued to be a slow trickle of incidents, some of them quite dramatic, of terrorism waged on behalf of Chechen independence.
And then what about the tie to radical Islam?
That's an equally good question. And when you get to motivations, may it have been an expression of the Chechen conflict in particular? It's possible. May it have been an expression of some broader anti-American Islam? That's possible. It could have been an expression of two isolated, lonely kids in Boston. There's some material out there on the internet where apparently one of these kids in a documentary that was done about him said, "I don't have a single American friend." I just think it's hazardous to speculate. But I think it was surprising probably to everybody that there was this Chechen connection.
Do you think it is just a coincidence? Do you think that's a possibility?
I think it's a possibility. I think probably in the past we've learned not to jump to conclusions too quickly on who's doing these things and why they're doing them. But the fact that they're from Chechnya and the fact that there's been so much terrorism emanating from that region and so much violence in the region makes you wonder whether that's not either directly or indirectly involved.
And then what does this mean, do you think, for Russian and U.S. relations?
That's a really good question, and I think a lot of people are speculating that. I've been trying to read the Russian press this morning. I think there's some sentiment I've seen that says this may actually give the two sides a common concern and actually be something they can work together on. After the World Trade Center was bombed, the first foreign leader to call President Bush was Vladimir Putin, and the Russians make a big deal out of this. They saw themselves, because they have been subject to this terrorism coming out of Chechnya, they see themselves as being in the same battle. Throughout the last 10 or 15, the period since the World Trade Center bombing, that relationship is frayed, partly over their disagreement about what we were doing in Iraq, partly over our disagreement about the level of violence they were using in Chechnya. And so there's been some resentment, I think, in Russia at the fact that even as we were fighting a similar war, we seemed very unsympathetic about the tactics they were using to try to suppress violence in Chechnya. And so I think there's some hope early on, just in these first few hours, that maybe this will put the two countries more on the same side again. And
you said that the events in Boston could expose, you said, two sides of a common concern. What are those two sides?
Well, one is the idea that the United States and Russia can really be on the same side of this. I think the other the other side is that this is something not very pleasant, that if it's tied back to Russia, you could see creating some problems. I don't think anybody is going to blame this on the Russian government, of course.
That it was done independently from the Russian government, totally a ballistic attack, you could say.
I'm not sure what you mean by ballistic, but certainly independent. I mean, again, Russia has been subject to, I couldn't tell you how many, I'd have to go look it up, tens of terrorist attacks emanating from Chechnya by people who want to get Russia out of Chechnya. And hundreds of Russians have been killed by these attacks, and so the Russians, I think, very much have a sense of they've experienced this.
So would incentives for Chechnyans be nationalism, establishing nationalism?
Oh, that's clearly, again, we're leaving aside these bombers, the explicit claim of or demand of many of the terrorists coming from Chechnya is that Russia allow Chechnya to become an independent country. That's been a desire that goes back to the time that the Russian Empire moved into that territory in the 19th century, and it really has brewed up again since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And do you think that this is just the start of a chain of events that is to come? Do you think there is more to come?
I doubt it. Again, we have to learn more. Were these just two guys? Were they linked to some larger group? I don't think there's any good reason for Chechen separatists to take their case to the United States. I think the fact that this happened in the United States is probably linked to the fact that that's where these two guys happen to be, rather than there was some particular desire to get at the United States. But that obviously that remains to be investigated.
And do you have any more speculations about this entire case?
I'm, like everybody else, I think, tempted to speculate, in my common sense is telling me to refrain, and instead I'm trying to learn as much as I can at this point, like everybody else.
What have you learned so far that stood out to you?
One of the things, is how quickly the information changes. I saw something on a Russian website this morning that had these guys living in Kyrgyzstan. And as it turns out, it wasn't Kyrgyzstan, it was Kazakhstan, which, to a lot of American viewers, listeners may sound like the same thing, but they're very different places. So we're just, it's the early days of trying to sift out their backgrounds. I have more questions than answers at this point. Where, we know they're of Chechen ethnicity. My understanding is they may have been born in Chechnya, but I don't think we know how much time did they actually spend in that territory. From what I can tell from the Russian press, one of them at least spent a year in Makhachkala, which is in Dagestan, which is just north and east of Chechnya, or east, I guess, more than north, which is an area that's also seen quite a bit of violence. So I think we really want to find out more about their biographies.
Thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome.
For Florida's 89.1 WUFT-FM, I'm Leah Harding in Gainesville.